Welcome to the Queerest Podcast, your cosmic guide to the queer universe. Hosted by Andraé BVR, each episode takes you on an interstellar journey through queer culture, identity, and influence. From dismantling media tropes to exploring queer representation, we invite you to challenge norms and expand your horizons. So buckle up and set your phasers to fabulous. Close encounters of the queerest kind await.
Greetings, cosmic queers and allies. I am your host, Andraé BVR, and this is the Queerest Podcast, your cosmic guide to the ever-expanding universe of queer culture, identity, and influence. And today, we are dimming the house lights and raising the curtain on a subject that's been both a mirror and a megaphone for our community, queer cinema. The flickering screen has always been a battleground and a sanctuary for LGBTQ plus expression. And while many of us have found ourselves in film long before we were allowed to say it out loud, the question remains, who decides which stories make it to the screen? And who's making sure our stories aren't just told, but remembered? Enter today's guest, Alonso Duralde, film critic, programmer, podcaster, prolific writer, and now author of Hollywood Pride, a celebration of LGBTQ plus representation and perseverance in film. For decades, Alonso has helped shape how we talk about queer film, from writing for The Wrap and The Advocate to co-hosting podcasts like Linoleum Knife, Breakfast All Day, Maximum Film, and Deck the Hallmark podcasts. He is one of the rare voices who is just as fluent in high camp as he is in auteur theory. And he's built a career showing us how queer cinema isn't a niche. It is the narrative backbone of cultural resistance and joy. So here's how today's journey breaks down. We'll kick things off with an incoming transmission, checking on what's lighting up the queer universe. Then we'll beam into a deep space dive with Alonso, unpacking his journey from film critique to authorship, why Hollywood Pride matters now, and how queer storytelling continues to defy erasure. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final frontier, our cosmic rapid-fire round of questions. But first, let's scan the queer skies and tune into what's coming through. You are now tuned in to the incoming transmission, our signal check on the queer universe, from culture shifts to policy moves. This is where we track what's changing and how we move through it together. Today's topic is queer cinema. So let's talk about queer film and storytelling, because we are in a moment where visibility feels fragile and platforms are quietly rewriting what is safe content. The shows that gave us life, canceled mid-season. Queer characters that weren't tragic or tokenized, written out or buried under algorithms. The stories that dared to be joyful, weird, political, or radically honest, pushed aside in favor of broader appeal. And it's not just oversight, it's erasure with a budget. Somewhere between test screenings and shareholder decks, queerness got deemed too risky, again. But here's what the data and history shows us. Queer stories matter. They reshape culture, they reframe reality, and they offer generations of LGBTQ plus folks a lifeline, a mirror, and a map. And they're most powerful when they reflect the full spectrum of queerness. That means leaning into intersectionality, showing us how queerness collides with race, class, gender, identity, disability, immigration status, and more. Queer cinema is at its most radical and revelatory when it refuses to flatten identity for mainstream culture. My take, if you want queer liberation, fund queer imagination. Support the films, the shows, the creators. Champion the intersectionality. Don't just stream the stories, sustain them. And that's today's incoming transmission from the queer universe. Let's beam into our deep space dive with Alonso. Before we enter today's deep space dive, let us zoom out for a moment and take in the scope of Hollywood Pride, a celebration of LGBTQ representation and perseverance in film. Alonso's latest work and a sweeping chronicle of queer cinema's legacy. For generations, LGBTQ plus artists shaped Hollywood from the shadows, on sets, behind cameras, and inside scripts, even when they couldn't live openly. But make no mistake, they were everywhere. One of the first ever sound films made in Thomas Edison's lab featured two men dancing while playing a violin. It lasted just a few minutes, but it captures one of cinema's earliest queer moments. In Hollywood Pride, Alonso maps that legacy from the pansy craze of the 1930s to the new cinema of the 90s to the bold, brilliant storytelling of today. He spotlights not only the performers and creators who helped define Hollywood, but also the queer filmmakers who refused to be erased and insisted on telling their own stories. Alonso is the chief U.S. film critic for The Film Verdict and co-host of The Linoleum Knife, Breakfast All Day, Maximum Film, and Deck the Hallmark podcasts. His books include the beloved Hollywood guide, Have Yourself a Movie Little Christmas, returning this year with an expanded second edition. He's also the co-author of I'll Be Home for Christmas Movies and has appeared on TCM, CNN, ABC, and across multiple documentaries. Now let's welcome the voice behind that history, Alonso Duralde. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. And for those that don't know, I used to work alongside Mr. Alonso here at Outfest, where he was doing some amazing work curating and programming the future of queer cinema at Outfest. So great to have you. And let's get into it. And I want to start off first with a little bit of like your origin story a little bit and kind of like the passion of it all kind of kicked off. So when did you first develop your love of film, and how did your identity shape the way that you viewed the stories playing out on screen?
I always tell the story that one of the main ways that I learned how to read as a child, apart from, Sesame Street, which was brand new at the time, was that I would go right to the movie listing page of the newspaper in Atlanta where I was growing up, and I could tell you what was showing in any theater in about in a 10-mile radius from our house. Even though I wasn't even really going to movies yet, I just like fixated on this thing. I compare it to, there's this movie called Searching for Bobby Fischer, where a little kid goes to the park and he sees people playing chess for the first time, and he comes home and immediately recreates a chessboard in his room using stuffed animals. Like, he doesn't even know what it is, but he knows that that's what he's all about. And so that's what movies kind of were for me. And they've always just been my main area of focus. And, in the process of, growing up and reading about film, I was one of those people who would stand in the library stacks and read Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet.
Yes.
I would never check it out, heaven forbid, but I would stand in the library and read it, and knowing about that queer history as it tied into cinematic history obviously was hugely influential for me, and kind of got me to where I went, which was both, working as a film critic, but also, working for queer film festivals.
Yeah, no. And I would say like, that's super relatable. Like, as somebody who was, a closeted queer youth who, whenever you're at like the bookstore or the movie store and you see something that's like queer, and then you go up to it and you like look at it and like, you're intrigued and like, why am I so intrigued by this? What's the word?
Putting it back on the shelf before anybody notices.
Exactly. And like making sure like mom and dad are not watching me while I'm doing this. And like it's very that, but very relatable. I love that. What do you think drew you though specifically to like film criticism and programming as a profession? And like how has your queerness influenced the way that you approach the work?
It's sort of like how they tell people, if you want to be an actor, you have to really want it so much that you don't have a plan B, and I never had a plan B. As soon as I kind of, Siskel and Ebert's show, their original PBS show debuted when I was like 8. And so I think the idea of like, wait, this is a job, you can do this for a living. Once that took hold, I was like, all right, well, that is what I want to do. And then, as far as like film festivals, it kind of started when I was in college. I was the main programmer. We had an on-campus cinema. This was in the era right before you could get cable TV on campus. So the cinema was still a big deal and people went to the movies a lot. And so that kind of gave me a rudimentary understanding of like scheduling things and, doing little, putting things together that made sense, or, like programming over the course of like several months and what that would look like. And then also like how to write short, punchy blurbs that made people want to come see the movies. So all of that stuff wound up becoming very valuable later when I started working for festivals. And, as far as like my queerness goes, I mean, I think sure that has shaped my taste in various ways, but also I think it's just, I think in the arts, whether your whatever your orientation is or your identity, you should always be curious, and you should always be like interested in voices that are not yours. One of the things I always loved about Outfest is whoever was running the show when they would give their opening night speech, it's always like, you know what? If you're a gay man, go see a movie about like lesbians or trans people. If you're a lesbian, go see a movie like see movies about people that are not you.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is so great about cinema in general, is that you get to be privy to conversations that you would never get to listen to. You get to witness lives that would never cross your path. And it's the old Ebert line about cinema as a machine that creates empathy, and at its best, I think it lets us in on lives that we would never know anything about, but it also kind of provides those points of connection where we realize, oh, we have this in common, even though we're completely different in where we're from and how we live and all that other stuff.
Yeah, no, I totally feel that. And I've taken that that note from the Outfest programming team about exploring the movies and shows and films that are not part of your identity. I think that's so important because it allows you, like you said, to really get outside of your own perspective. You allow yourself to have your world grow in a way that you would have never otherwise probably had the opportunity to. And for me, that is still something that I hold true to the way I consume, media specifically. And I want to see these other stories. I want to understand the poses of the world, or just different concepts, different ideas, different people that I think it allows me to have a much more expansive perspective of what the world looks like, and also what our community looks like in general, because we're all so different. We have different identities, different struggles. And I think being able to see that stuff is not only powerful for those who are being represented, but those who are receiving the information and understanding that they would have otherwise not been able to do. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I want to actually now get into your book, because this book, and I told you this before we even started, this book is phenomenal. You are a prolific writer and you do brilliant writing, but I love this book so much, not only for the visuals, not only for the way it's structured, but it is just so well written, the way it allows you to go through the different decades of queer cinema, from the early times of Thomas Edison's lab to the modern day filmmakers and creators, and how our genres have shifted and changed. You have outdone yourself, sir, and I think you should be freaking proud of this.
Thank you.
It's literally my new favorite book that I'm gonna bring over to friends so that they can see this and they can dive in, because it's just there's so much information, and it's a part of our history as a community that this is required reading. Legit, I think this needs to be in curriculum for students, because it's there's so much to learn from these stories. There's so much to learn from how we as a people have progressed ourselves in society and in culture, but also just the evolution of how we've done it and the approach that they've taken. And it's just so beautiful. So a major that. So, but I want to know, why did you feel this was the right time specifically to write this book in the way that you did?
Actually, it was pitched to me. TCM has worked with Running Press, and I had done the Hallmark book with Running Press, I'll Be Home for Christmas Movies. And so they reached out to me, and they had already done Donald Bogle's Hollywood Black, which, it was turned into a miniseries this year wonderfully by Justin Simeon. And they had done Luis Reyes's book, Viva Hollywood, which was focused on, the Latino Hispanic presence in the film industry. So this was sort of next up for them, was all right, let's do the queer one. And they came to me with it, and I was thrilled to come up with a pitch for it. And it's that thing where I thought, oh yeah, I know this, I got this, it's fine. I've been studying this for years. I've been trying to keep up with this. I know all about it. And then of course you start writing it and you're like, oh shit, I had no idea about this person or this connection to that other thing. And so I learned a lot while doing it. And thank you for pointing out about the structure, because no art ever happens in a vacuum. And I thought specifically, if we're going to talk about LGBTQ plus cinema, we have to talk about LGBTQ plus history. And so at the beginning of each section, where we're at different decades, I felt it was important to let people know, here's the context of what's going on in the world. Here's, the Weimar Republic giving way to the Nazis burning down Magnus Hirschfeld's library. Here is the McCarthy era and, all queer people being targeted as potential communists. Mm-hmm. Here's Stonewall. Here's AIDS. Here's, all of these things. And so I like to think that that's giving people an idea of like what made these movies pop up at the precise moment that they did.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's to that point, it's like, it's a reflection of the time and how the artists of that time and creators reflected back what was happening to them in their real life experiences. And so it's like
exactly
a time capsule, but it's also like a message around what was happening and how they responded to it. I love that.
It's like dispatches from the front,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And obviously your book, traces more than a century of film, and obviously starting with the Edison Company test reel. What are some like key trends or patterns, just like top line of that you saw over that time period that evolved for queer cinema and representation?
Well, like I think a very big deal for how queer characters were represented and queer stories were told or not told. You have the Hays Code happening in the early 30s. And that is this very sort of draconian statute where studios were afraid of local censorship boards and of local sort of like, this projectionist was going to decide he was going to like chop this part out of the movie if they found it objectionable. So they decided to like have these rules where like, okay, we can't have a man and a woman on a bed unless one of them has their foot on the floor, that we can't have, sex out of marriage. We can't show drug use. We can't
Right.
And one of the categories was sex perversion. And that was this blanket ban on any kind of realistic, literal depiction of LGBTQ plus characters. So then it becomes a thing of like, well, what can we slip in that the censors aren't going to get, that like audiences who get it will get it, mm-hmm. but other people will be like, oh, well, that guy sure is flamboyant, So, it's kind of fascinating to look at like these stealth queer characters that are popping up in Hollywood movies in plain sight, but sort of like, oh, he's a sissy or she's so tough, whatever. So that kind of thing was happening. And then, you look at how, the rise of sort of American indie cinema in the 60s and 70s of people like John Cassavetes, who were kind of making movies outside of the studio system, give way to people like Arthur Bresson Jr., who I think is a fascinating figure, because here's a guy who is making like queer documentaries and queer narrative films, and he's also an adult filmmaker. And so he's making, what is technically pornography, but even in that sphere, he is telling queer stories. And in, the late 60s, early 70s, even with the lifting of the production code and the erasure of the Hays Office rules, like mainstream Hollywood was not yet ready or interested in telling queer stories. So yes, pornography was pornography, but it also showed like gay men living in big cities and like having lives and careers and relationships and that kind of thing. And so that kind of fills this gap between, complete disappearance out of mainstream movies and like this sort of slow acceptance of like, well, I guess we can give the heroine a gay best friend as long as he's funny, So just little things like that along the way. And then obviously AIDS hits and, what tiny little progress was being made in Hollywood gets shoved completely backwards. And then that gives way to the new queer cinema of the early 90s, which is this very sort of angry and radical and often experimental kind of work. And because it's winning awards at Sundance and it's getting great reviews and people are flocking to see these movies because there's nothing else queer in the culture. Christine Vachon, the legendary producer, talked about how a movie as difficult and experimental as Poison would never have been a hit later. But coming out in like the early 90s where there was just nothing on the landscape, queer audiences flocked to that movie because it was queer, And so and then once those movies start making money, then you start seeing like, oh, well, what if we do kind of like cute mainstream rom-coms that happen to be about queer couples and da-da-da. And, so things just kind of one thing rolls into the next thing, rolls into the next thing.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that too. And I think from my work at Outfest and just being around programmers who are just like so deeply like versed in queer cinema, like I learned so much from you. I learned so much from like Cheryl and Daniel and Mike and Lucy and all of the people. It was just so great. I think like for me, seeing that evolution, I think is so interesting just to be, at a time where queerness was much more stigmatized, much more demonized. It was criminalized in cases. Like to see that evolution to where we're at now. And I think like there's still a lot of gaps with, queer cinema that definitely need to be filled. We need to be more expansive in our storytelling. I think it shows that progress that's happening within society and culture that is promising and is exciting. And it shows that like we're more than just like these negative stereotypes that a lot of people have towards us. And we're human. What a concept, right? So.
and again, like, look, stereotypes come from somewhere, and there you can tell stories about characters like that and be true and smart and empathetic. And it's sort of like the whole thing. I remember in the early 90s when everybody was mad about, Silence of the Lambs and Basic Instinct, and rightly so, because that's all we were getting. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, look, queer villains, great. Yes. Like we can be the worst. Yes. We can be treacherous and evil and all that stuff. But like, we need to be part of this complete breakfast. You need a balance of all kinds of queer characters because we represent all kinds of people.
Oh, completely. Like literally that this could literally be its own episode just about like queer coded villains. Like there's
sure.
Even from like the animated stuff, like the Jafar's world or like Ursula being like
your generation, I think Scar from The Lion King is definitely,
Exactly. But it was always interesting because like when I would watch those individuals or those characters within these films, I was like, why am I intrigued by them? Like, why is there stirring happening? You know what I mean? So like, for me, it's like now knowing that information. And even like, I was just watching Pee-wee as himself the other day, and I was so impressed with like, I could see what he was doing when I was watching it, even when I was younger. But like to see it confirmed and to understand that he himself was part of our community, I think was so, it gives it a totally new life. And I actually literally watched Pee-wee's Big Adventure last night in preparation for this. So I felt very, very ready for this.
Yeah, I mean, Pee-wee Herman was a very subversive character, and I think really got away with a lot under the guise of like, oh, it's comedy, it's for kids, it's this character. Yes. But as a character, he was really like challenging a lot of perceptions of like, what is a man, what is masculine behavior? What does a hero look like? Yep. And I mean, you look at Pee-wee's Playhouse, and I mean, that show is so playing around with like gender and all kinds of things in a way that is perfectly kid friendly, but at the same time, like I think really expansive in its notion of how people behave and how they get to be. And so, stuff like that, where you're kind of slipping it under the radar, and maybe a lot of viewers are only getting it at this level. But if you're, if it speaks to you, you're like, oh, I see what we're doing here, and more of that, please.
Literally. Yeah. I loved his character specifically because it's like, I saw elements of myself in him. And I think that's so much more resonant with me. And like, there's times when I feel more butch. There are times where I feel more femme. There's like, it's just so like, there's the spectrum of my identity, and being able to see somebody who embraced their, effeminate side. I think that is like so cool as somebody who was, growing up and, figuring out my identity and trying to understand that, you know what I mean? So I love that about that. And rest in peace, Paul Rubens, because he really did a big one. Love that.
He truly was a rebel and a loner.
He was, exactly. Good reference. I love that. I want to know now, like, what was like that first on-screen moment for you that made you feel seen as a queer viewer?
Hard to say. I mean, like, I definitely, I came up with like these sort of, I later got to interview him for The Advocate, which was great, but like Charles Nelson Riley on The Match Game, I think was something that I really clued into, like, okay, I like this guy, and he's funny, and he's smart, and he's not taking any guff, and he's being very himself, So like that sort of Paul Lynde, kind of Rip Taylor generation of like outrageous, funny men on TV, definitely. I remember when I was in like junior high, a friend of mine's parents took me to see Polyester. John Waters' Polyester, which was definitely like not a movie I think my parents would have been thrilled that I was going to see at that age. But I remember there's like a moment where Divine's character has this sexual fantasy about like a pizza delivery guy. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking like, wait, that's a dude. And then that's another dude grinding on that dude. And and I just sort of like stored that away for a very long time.
I love that. Yeah, like for me, like when I think I saw, it was first movie that like really like connected with me as a queer viewer was like Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I think is a lot of
yeah.
for a lot of people, because it's like there's just so much stuff happening there. Tim Curry being the brilliant Dr. Frankenfurter, and like it was just like so good the way that the music was, the dancing, the time warp, like all of it. It just like I didn't know what to do with those feelings at the time. I think when I first saw it, you know what I mean? I was just like, what is
that movie is so many people's gateway drug into like I don't know what I'm feeling now, but it's something. And there's of the million things that are going on in this movie, I'm relating to a chunk of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that movie is just amazing. I love those midnight screenings too that they do. Like, I think that's the fact that it still has such a cult following and still like it resonates with so many people. So I love that. That
it is still in active theatrical release 50 years later,
which says so much about like why, you know, the impact of it and the power of cinema and how decades later can really still resonate with so many people in so many different ways, which is like, that's the power of cinema.
Yeah, and I think it's become this sort of rite of passage where for high schoolers and college students, and you know, yes, you can stream it, and yes, you can own it on Blu-ray, but it is the thing about going to the place and having that experience and seeing it with the other people and being in the dark and yelling at the screen and dressing up and all of that stuff becomes this, like I said, it is a legitimate rite of passage in our society.
Completely agree. And I want to see, like, what is your opinion on like the role that queer cinema plays, not just in visibility, but like in transformation, both like personally and like politically, I would say.
Well, you know, I think there's a real power in seeing yourself represented, you know, whatever it is about you that it is, whether it's about your ethnicity, whether it's about your nationality or your religion or whatever else. And so, yeah, I think for queer people, there's something about seeing yourself in a movie that makes it real. You know, it's not even just like, oh, I'm not the only one, but it's like, no, this is a thing in the world that exists and it is captured on film. And so I know that like it's really out there, and maybe I can't address it within myself yet. Maybe I can't tell other people about it yet, but I know it's there because I saw it in a movie, you know? And so, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, it in some way gives permission for people maybe who don't feel like they have it. And, you know, I think it gives the idea of like, I'm allowed to be attracted to not even just the mechanics. Like I'm allowed to be attracted to another dude, but like I'm allowed to be attracted to whatever the subcategory is, because it's like it's presented in a film, and there's something about the gaze of the camera that affords a legitimacy to things, and I think it really can open up people's perspectives. And I think it's also, you know, I always go back to you know, Obama changed his mind about, you know, marriage equality because Biden pushed him into it, and Biden changed his mind about marriage equality because he watched Will and Grace.
Exactly.
You know, So I think that I would like to think that for a lot of parents, maybe who think like, oh God, my kid is queer and I'm really upset about that and I'm worried about that and I don't know what kind of life they're going to have, that they can see films and think like, okay, well, there is a life and there is, you know, there are possibilities, and it's not just my worst fears about every terrible thing that I think society is going to do to them. You know, I think it provides perspective for everybody, for queer people and non-queer people alike, to sort of understand the place that queer people occupy in the world.
Yeah, 1000%. And slight Will and Grace tangent, because all good conversations require one. But that show, I think, like, I'm glad so much that Joe Biden watched that, because I think if he hadn't, who knows where a lot of other stuff would have netted out. But like that show, one, that is something I probably go to sleep to every night with my husband. We put that on and set the sleep timer on and then like set and forget it. But like that show, I still watch it all the time. I think there's just so many elements of it, that stuff that's a little dated and problematic, but I think there's a lot of stuff that is so representative of the time, the way that these characters existed, the way that, you know, just understanding what it's like to be gay in New York in that time period. I love those characters so much, and I love how much it helped me like accept my identity. And I think that's the power of like queer media in general. It's like you're able to see it and you're able to verify that it's not just in your head. It's like we're real, and it's like it's okay to be gay. And I think like that show did a great job of like showcasing those characters, you know, going through their development of their identity and like, the different parts of the community in a really fun, lighthearted way that like really resonated with me, and obviously Joe Biden. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's a portrait of being gay, white, and wealthy in New York in the 2000s.
Exactly.
But, you know, it's a start. It's a start.
Exactly. And I think it gave space for other, you know, queer projects to expand upon that narrative and explore different things that were not just so singular and limited in kind of what they were doing. So, yeah, shout out to Will and Grace. Love you to the cast and the creators of that. Okay, so would love to talk about now like the overall like industry insights and trends that you've noticed as you did the research for this book. And specifically, like, are there genres you think that queer filmmakers are actively reshaping now? Where do you think the state of the queer cinema is right now?
I think if we can learn anything from, like I said, the you know, AIDS really became this rallying point of, you know, I think it got a lot of people who were in the industry to kind of start coming out more and being more vocal.
Right.
You look at people like Steven Stucker from, you know, the Airplane movies. You look at Patton from Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Yeah. You know, and again, I think it inspired the silence and the active homophobia of that period really inspired a wave of filmmakers. And as awful as things are right now, particularly for the trans community, but really for all of us in the LGBTQ plus community, I think that it is also inspiring, you know, and I part of me wishes it weren't, but it is, you know, it is inspiring, you know, artists to get out there and be more queer and be more vocal and more angry because, you know, we can't rely on the government. We can't even rely on corporations. I think in the 90s and the 2000s, there was this thing of like, oh, look, they did a rainbow logo for June. Isn't that great? Like, oh, look, they've got a float in the parade. Right. And like this year, we're seeing like, you know, a lot of people pulling out of parade sponsorship because, you know, Target doing like little tiny rainbows at the edge of a beige, you know, blouse. Yeah. Like, it's Pride, everybody, you know, and then they didn't even bother to write the copy for the Pride label.
Oh, you know, I know, I saw that. I was like, what?
Yeah. So we cannot rely on like these fair weather folks. And so, you know, I think that, you know, and this is a moment where queer film festivals are more important than ever, where supporting queer artists is more important than ever. And I think shows like this are great about like giving a megaphone to people in the community who are out there doing work. You know, I think certainly, you know, I'm finding a lot more trans filmmakers who are out there getting their stuff done, even if it's like micro budget movies, you know, like filmmakers like Alice Mayo McKay are out there doing these cool like horror films and stuff. And so, you know, I hope that people understand that when Disney and whoever else decides, okay, maybe we're not going to put this tertiary queer character into a superhero movie anymore because it might offend somebody. Right. Like, they were never going to help you. They were never going to break any barricades for you. They were going to pay us lip service and like hopefully try and make a little money off our backs by throwing us the tiniest of crumbs. Yeah. But like, if you have a nonprofit queer film festival in your city, go support it. If you have, you know, if you know about filmmakers who are like renting their movies on Vimeo, go watch them. Like, you know, do what you can to make queer art happen because we can't rely on anybody else.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think it's like, I can't remember which person said this, but they were basically saying like you support all queer media, whether it's, you know, films, shows, podcasts, books, whatever it is, because we need to be able to show to these industry leaders that there is a desire to see these type of stories. There is a desire to, you know, consume and share and discuss all these things. And if we don't show up for the stuff that maybe it's something that maybe you don't want to see, you may miss out on things that you could see that they could have given funding for that would have been like something that you would have loved. You know what I mean? It's so like,
I'm a big,
you know what I mean, to do that.
I'm a big believer in voting with your dollar, but I think also, I think there's this, you know, we can't rely on the gatekeepers to decide like, okay, I guess since this gay thing made money, we'll put money into that lesbian thing. Like, cut out the middleman, like go out there and find the queer authors, the queer filmmakers, the queer musicians, and, you know, like, you can support them directly. You can buy their stuff, you can buy their merch, you can subscribe to their Patreons, whatever it is. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to do that because, all the people who wanted to sponsor parades in 2024, who decided they weren't going to sponsor parades in 2025, can all go kick rocks. And so we've got to be there for each other because we are a community and we have things to say and we have things to say to each other.
Right.
And so we need to support that. And if larger corporations want to underwrite that and they realize that there's money to be made there, great, fine. I'm not against corporate product. Hachette put out my book, but I think the last year and a half has shown how quickly people that we thought were going to, support us as corporate entities can just decide not to.
Yeah, like that. It's ridiculous. And I'm curious for your, as somebody who is an avid lover of cinema and, in my opinion, a huge expert in queer cinema, like, what are the stories you think we need to hear more of? Like, what are more creative risks you think filmmakers and creators should be taking in order to push cinema in a direction that feels, impactful or allows for a more expansive storytelling experience?
I mean, not for me to say, really. I think that's one of the cool things about art is that like people create stuff and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know I needed that, but I totally do. I for years when people would ask me, who's a gay historical figure that needs to have a biopic made about them, for years, my answer was Bayard Rustin. And now we have one,
Yes.
So I think there's so much of our story that needs to be told and reiterated. And I think we've only just scratched the surface about really talking about AIDS and how it was so widely ignored, how it was the devastating impact that it had on the community. There have been a handful of films, but I think there's a lot more stories there to be told. Yen Tan's 1985, I think, is a great one. The French film BPM. Mm-hmm. But, there's a lot to talk about and a lot to talk about, like, not just how it affected, like white dudes, like it was devastating to communities of color. It was devastating, to the African subcontinent. There's a lot of different ways to approach that. But yeah, I want to learn stuff that I didn't know about. Like, because as much as I tried to pour into this book, there are tons of corners of queer history and important figures and like turning points in the culture or in the law or whatever that I don't know a lot about. And I want those stories told because I think we should know that stuff as well as we know, like, I don't know, like, how many movies about World War II have we seen at this point? There should be that many about queer history.
I agree. No, that's a fair point. I want to now kind of shift a little bit to discuss your, beyond the book that you just created, Hollywood Pride, which again, I cannot say enough good things about because it was just so amazing. But you've also written Have Yourself a Movie Little Christmas, 101 must-see movies for gay men, and I'll Be Home for Christmas movies. Within that context, how does Hollywood Pride reflect your evolution as a cultural writer?
Well, I mean, 101 Must-See Movies for Gay Men was a book that I did a long time ago when I was working at The Advocate. And and my main impetus was, we would have these interns in the office who were in their early 20s. Mm-hmm. And they seemed unaware of any movie made before The Matrix. And so, it's not like I was super old at the time. I was in my 30s. So I was like, what? So I felt like I had to make this list of like, how has no one told you that you should watch Whatever Happened to Baby Jane or, Showgirls or, Victim or whatever. And it's, I look back at it now and I'm like, girl, calm down. Like, who are you to tell anybody what they need to be watching? But, I just thought it was sort of like a fun little list of things. And so this one was a lot of fun to do. And I think really illuminating because, we've had like Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet, which is about cinematic representation of queer characters.
Yes.
And we've had William Mann's Behind the Screen, which is about, the queer people working in the industry behind the scenes that maybe people didn't know about. And so this was kind of like, well, what if we put it all in one book? us on screen, us off screen, all of the ways in which queer people have been central to the evolution of cinema as we know it, So that was a real blast. And so between, I always joke now, like if because my niche is queer film and Christmas movies, June and December, I have them on lockdown.
That's amazing. And like with this particular book, like what was the hardest part you would say compared to like the previous books that you've written before?
This one, I mean, the hardest part I think was just keeping to the word count. I had something like, I can't even remember now, but it was, not nearly as long as I really needed to try and cover everything. Like, I think I even say in the book, like, look, after 1990, if I don't include like your favorite movie or filmmaker, like, sorry, all bets are off. But yeah, just trying to wrap my arms around 130 years of movie making within a certain, word count was like daunting, but I managed it.
Yeah, you did. Sure did. And what I want to now like kind of discuss a little bit about like you're a prolific writer, you're a prolific podcaster, you were part of Linoleum Knife, Breakfast All Day, Maximum Film, Deck the Hallmark podcast. Like, how has podcasting helped you expand conversations around queer film and mainstream cinema?
I think what's great about podcasts is that you really can shape them however you want, So like Linoleum Knife is a movie where my husband and I talk about new movies, but it's also us talking about like what's in the oven and, when are those dishes going to get done? So people know it's going to take a good 15 or 20 minutes for us to get to the movie part, right? Because we're just going to be talking about stuff. And also because like it's our show, we can go as obscure as we want. Like Dave loves nothing more than to talk about, a 3-hour Filipino movie that's showing in 2 theaters, maybe, and we'll also talk about like, Thunderbolts next to that, so it whatever we want to do. And so it gives us the license to talk about smaller queer films as they pop up because, we get to set the agenda there. And, Maximum Film, the whole point of that show, the sort of, kind of tagline is, it's a movie podcast that isn't hosted by 3 straight white guys. So, there's me, who is the queer white guy. We have Drea Clark, who's a woman, who's a festival programmer, is a producer, and we have Kevin Avery, who is a Black comedian and cultural observer. So we're able to talk about smaller niche movies when we feel like it, but we can also look at a movie like Thunderbolts from the perspective of a queer guy, a Black guy, and a woman, and you're going to hear about that movie in a different way than you're going to get from a lot of other podcasts.
That's amazing. And I'm curious, like, just going back to Linoleum Knife, like, what was the thing that inspired y'all to create a podcast together, you and your husband Dave? Like, how'd that happen?
So, wow. Okay. This podcast turns 15 this year. So way back in 2010, I was popping up on 2 different cable shows. There used to be a network called Current that was owned by Al Gore, and they had the Rotten Tomatoes show, and I was one of their regular critics. And then briefly on IFC, there was a show called The Grid that was all like sort of like little quick bite nuggets about different pop cultural stuff. So in the course of about 2 weeks, both shows got canceled. And I just remember coming home one day and being like, I want to be on something that only I can cancel. And Dave and I had done some other people's podcasts. Our friend Gray Drake had a show at the time called The Popcorn Mafia. And we were like, and I was like, I want to do a podcast. And he goes, he didn't want to do it at first. And then he was like, I'll do it as long as I don't have to be on camera. I'm like, no, it's fine. It'll just be audio and whatever. And so grudgingly, he did it. And then it wound up being a thing we really enjoyed doing. And then when we started doing a Patreon, it actually became like a significant chunk of our annual income, so thankfully, like, it all worked out in a way that we got it in kind of early, and we're never going to be a gigantic podcast, but we have a very dedicated audience. It's a small one, but like they really like what we do and they're willing to pay for extra shows that we do. And so, yeah, podcasting, I think, has been a really great opportunity, especially as so much of print media and even online media has been collapsing.
Yes.
It is a constant refrain from all the film critics I know, except for like the precious few of them who like have a steady gig at, one of the remaining trades or one of the last newspapers that's still standing. For a lot of us, we had to kind of DIY it, and podcasting is a great way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm most amazed, honestly, with the fact that you have been able to be on so many different podcasts and like you still have so much to say, and it's all this brilliant and interesting discourse, and like you're an encyclopedia of information. And that's what I always appreciate about you, because like I know if I have a conversation with Alonso, I'm going to learn something, and I love learning. I love chatting with you.
Yeah, I am someone who doesn't shut up, so I think I found my medium.
Yeah, exactly. Love that. For the end of this segment, I wanted to ask, what is one thing that you hope that readers take away from Hollywood Pride?
Probably just the idea that we've been part of this from the get-go. Like Justin Simeon wrote me a really beautiful blurb where he talked about how it's not like we have to, establish, cinema, it's ours too. It's like, no, cinema is ours. Like we've molded this thing from the get-go, and we've been involved in its crafting and in on-screen, presentations and what, being a matinee idol is, or what being a character actor is, or what being a director or an editor, or, all of these things. Like queer people shaped that stuff. So if anything, non-queer people need to sort of like carve out their little place and their stake in movies, because it's ours, baby. We've been there the whole time, and we've been essential into turning it into what it is now.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, well, that brings us to the final frontier, our signature closing segment where we ask every guest the same 5 questions to wrap things up. Some fast takes, some real talk, and a peek at what makes Alonso. Answer as quickly or as thoughtfully as you'd like. There are no only wrong people. Just kidding. Let's get into it. This first one, we're going to take a little deviation from film and actually tap into a little bit of music. But what is your go-to queer anthem that never fails to get you pumped?
I will make the case that No Matter What Happens from Yentl is a hell of a queer anthem.
Yeah.
And somebody needs to remix it, I think, into, a dance floor jam. But it is, you look at the lyrics and it is so much about somebody refusing to remain in the closet and who's not going to lie about themselves to themselves anymore. It's a great song.
I love that. That's a great one. If your LGBTQ identity came with a tagline, what would it say?
This bitch has opinions.
Wow, that's hilarious. If you could have one queer superpower, what would it be? And it has to be a queer superpower. It can't just be a regular one like flying.
My raised eyebrow would come with a laser beam.
I love that. Next question I have for you is, what is your favorite piece of queer content right now that you are obsessed with? Could be a film, a show, a book, podcast, just anything that you would love to share with other people that you think is, required reading or required consuming.
The great Alison Bechdel has a new book out. You probably know her as the creator of Fun Home, which was turned into the Tony-winning Broadway musical. She also, for years, did a great comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For. And the characters from Dykes to Watch Out For pop up in her new book, Spent. And another character in that book is also Alison Bechdel. So it's always exciting when she's got something new out, and it just hit shelves. So that should be your Pride Month required reading.
I love that. Thank you so much. And just to wrap this part of the segment, where can folks find your work and get their hands on Hollywood Pride?
Well, Hollywood Pride is available wherever books are sold. So please, order it, get them to order it for you if you need to. Get your library to order a copy if they don't have a copy, and get your library to get the audio and ebook versions as well and enjoy them on the Libby app. It's all good, but you can also buy it in any of those 3 formats as well. If you want to read my stuff, I do reviews at thefilmverdict.com. And as Andraé pointed out, you can hear me on the Linoleum Knife, Maximum Film, Breakfast All Day, and Deck the Hallmark podcasts. And I've got a bunch of stuff happening in June that I won't bombard you with now, but it'll all be in the show notes. But I'm doing a 3-week series at the American Cinematheque at the Los Feliz 3. I'll be screening 35mm prints of the camp classic Cobra Woman and of the wonderful 90s trans movie Ma Vie en Rose. And Caden Mark Gardner, the co-author of the great book about trans cinema, Corpses, Fools, and Monsters, is showing a new remastered print of the Hollywood Lawn 1972 musical Scarecrow in a Garden of Cucumbers. I'm introducing a screening of Victor Victoria at Vidiots on June 7th. And I'm also part of an authors panel. I believe it's called the Pride Live series. And tune into TCM on June 23rd. Dave Karger and I will be co-hosting 4 pansy movies from the 1930s. We're showing Call Her Savage, The Gay Divorcee, Midnight, and Professional Sweetheart. So check those out as well.
Amazing. Alonso. Well, the TLDR here is Alonso is booked and busy, and we are not going to apologize for that. So that's great.
It's June.
It is exactly Pride Month. Alonso, thank you so much for joining us and helping us see queer cinema, not just as a genre, but as a legacy. Hollywood Pride, in my opinion, is more than just a film book. It's a time capsule. It is a call to action. And it's a reminder that we've always been here, even when the credits didn't name us. Queer film doesn't reflect, like literally, queer film doesn't just reflect who we are. It shapes how we see ourselves, how the world sees us, and how the future gets written. And whether it's in the shadows of classic Hollywood or the spotlight of today's streaming era, our stories persist, they evolve, and they matter. And cinema gives queerness dimension. It validates joy, it validates grief, it validates rage, it validates love. It rewrites endings that were once tragic and centers lives that history tried to erase. And that's why a book like Hollywood Pride, another product placement right here, is essential. Is it preserves and it celebrates the films that have gave us a mirror of when the world gave us closets. So here's your mission. Support queer filmmakers, listen to queer podcasters, go to queer film festivals, get a copy of Hollywood Pride, watch what the algorithm will not show you. And when you finish a film that resonates, share it, pass it along, talk about it. We need to talk about it more and not less, because queer film isn't niche. It is revolutionary. And with that said, again, Alonso, I thank you so much for this conversation. Appreciate you so much. And until next time, folks, stay curious.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Queerest Podcast. Thank you for joining us on this cosmic journey through the queer universe. If today's conversation resonated with you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your chosen family. Your voice helps grow the queerest community. Until next time, stay curious.